guys, it's Kira and welcome back to another video. Today I'm going to be talking you through all of the books that I managed to read in January, so it is officially time for the first reading wrap up of 2021. Now, if you saw the reading vlog that went up earlier this week on Wednesday, you'll know that I ended up having quite a difficult second half of January. You can obviously go and see all of the details in that vlog if you want to hear more about it, but the long and short of it is one of my pets was really ill, and sadly she did pass away. But in the couple of weeks leading up to that, I was really intensively looking after her, doing basically everything I could to try and make her better again, and obviously that was just quite emotionally and physically exhausting, and it left me with not very much free time. And when I did have free time, I didn't much feel like reading, and instead I just wanted to completely get lost in like TV shows and things that I didn't have to pay a huge amount of attention to. So with that being said, I managed to read a total of 5 books throughout January, which, given that piece of information, I'm very happy with, because honestly there was a time when I thought that I might finish January having read 2 books, which wasn't exactly the start to 2021 that I was hoping for, especially because I have upped my Goodreads goal for this year and I'm definitely already behind. But given the circumstances, finishing January having read 5 books, I'm very happy with, and we can all just hope that February is a better month. But with that being said, let's jump into the books that I did manage to read. Now, although it wasn't a great reading month on the whole, the first book that I read in January turned out to be incredible, and it's already one that I can see making its way onto my favourites book of the year. I know it's early to make those kinds of judgments, but when you know, you know. And the book that I'm talking about is The Most Fun We Ever Had by Claire Lombardo. This book has been on my shelves since summer, and I actually picked this one up mostly for its cover because it has such a beautifully sunny and summery cover. The yellow and blue is such a beautiful combination, but in my head that association made me just think of this as a summer book, so I wasn't thinking about reading this one really until next summer, or I guess this summer now. But then Em read it over the Christmas period and she really enjoyed it, and she said that it was the kind of book that she thought I was going to enjoy, so I took her word for it, and luckily she was very much correct because it was incredible. This is a really intricate family study of what can only be described as the most complicated family dynamic ever. We have David and Marilyn, who are husband and wife. They've been married for like 40 years, and then we also have their 4 daughters who are all grown up now. There's Wendy, Violet, Liza and Grace. And then of course each of those characters has various different people that they're involved with in their own personal lives, and there are lots of different crossovers in the ways that these individual lives sort of come together as a family in very complicated and often quite destructive ways. What I love about this book, I mean there are so many things, but what I really love about this book is the fact that it's multiple perspective and it has multiple timelines. So we of course have 6 main characters, which is quite a lot of main characters, and at first the way that you go into this book does feel a bit confusing because the different perspectives aren't necessarily very clearly marked out, but I think as you get into the book, maybe 50 or 100 pages, because it is about 500 or so pages long, so you get quite a lot of time to get to know the characters. So about 50 or so pages in, you start to get used to the writing style and the switches between different perspectives, and it all starts to make sense. And once it does, it becomes such an interesting way to get very different perspectives on the same events that all of these family members are going through, as well as seeing various parts of their history that have led them up to the present day and the various circumstances that we see them in. The book deals with lots of different topics such as loss and grief. It deals with the theme of adoption, it deals with mental health, eating disorders and lots of other different things, and I feel like it deals with them all really well, in the sense that it shows the ways that these individual experiences don't just affect one individual person, but in a family dynamic they sort of ripple out and create an effect for the entire family unit, which I think is really interesting and definitely something that's important to recognise with these really big topics. The family that we meet in this book is messy. They have so many different things going on, and at the core of it there is a lot of love and good intention, but I think that Claire Lombardo shows that love and good intention don't always cause everything to go perfectly. David and Marilyn could be, and actually are, viewed as like perfect parents by their children. Their relationship is like unshakable, and they're viewed as this like pinnacle of what your relationship should be, and even still all of their children have individual problems and they come into different situations of their life that don't go as well as they'd hoped. And I just think this is a great way of exploring that, money, wealth, happiness, love, they don't always create the perfect circumstances, despite the fact that you might think that they do. But still, I absolutely love this book. It's incredible. If you love character studies, you love diving into complicated family and relationship dynamics, then this book is a must read. The next book that I picked up in January was one that I was really excited to get to because I've seen so many people talking about it. But I actually had quite mixed feelings about this book, and I will obviously explain all of that. But I ended up giving it 3 stars, and the book was When No One Is Watching by Alyssa Cole. This was another multiple perspective narrative. In this book we have 2 perspectives, and I really did enjoy the dual perspective of this narrative, and I felt like it added a lot to the story. Within this book, we are set in a Brooklyn neighborhood, which is typically a neighborhood that's been inhabited by people of color. And one of the main themes of this narrative is the gentrification of this neighborhood and of lots and lots of other neighborhoods in similar areas, where essentially these people of color who have lived in a place for generations and generations are kind of being pushed out because they can't afford the area anymore. And then they're kind of being gradually replaced by more and more wealthy and often white people. So the 2 perspectives that we have offer an insight into both sides of this experience. We have Sydney, who has lived in this neighborhood for years and years and years, and who is really resistant to this gentrification, which is obviously pushing people out who she knows and loves and who've lived there alongside her for years and years as well. And then we have Theo, who along with his girlfriend has recently moved into the neighborhood and has basically taken a place that was once inhabited by someone that Sydney knew and loved. So the theme of gentrification was so interesting. It was something that I hadn't ever really read about before, but the way that Alyssa Cole explored it and educated the readers about this topic was so incredibly well done. It was interesting, educational, insightful, and I absolutely loved it. It was also really intriguing to see the fact that Sydney, as a sort of long-standing member of this community, viewed the gentrification very differently to the people that were coming in and just viewing it as a new up-and-coming neighborhood. And it was really intriguing to see the 2 sides of this experience. And Theo as a character is someone who I think resists the racist views of the people around him, but doesn't often do enough to actually challenge them. But through getting to know Sydney, gradually sees how important it is for him to use his voice and use his privilege and basically stand up for what is going on around him that is wrong. So that part of this book was really interesting. And another thing that I really liked was that each chapter of this book was divided by a little insight into a social media app called Our Hood, which is basically a social media app where people in certain neighborhoods can sort of talk to each other, sort of discuss community related topics and all of that kind of stuff. It's typically limited to about a page or half a page between each chapter, but basically we just again get that insight into the divide between the people who've lived in this neighborhood for years and then the much more racist views of the people that are gentrifying the area and moving in and taking up all of these places and raising up the prices. And we really see the divide coming out in the way that they interact on this app. And I don't always think the social media comes across very well in written format in books, but the way that this was kind of injected in and was very much used just as a divider between chapters to give you a little bit of extra context and insight worked really well and really authentically. So those parts of the book I loved. However, this book is marketed as a thriller, and there are certain elements of this book where I just don't think that the thriller part really worked, didn't have the effect that I was hoping for, and actually took away from the parts of the book that were really interesting. I think that the theme of gentrification and exploring the effect that it has on people in neighborhoods that are affected by it is strong enough on its own to be a book. However, the theme of gentrification essentially sort of dived into the fact that perhaps people in this neighborhood were being forcibly taken and used for testing as a way to remove them from the neighborhood and kind of put them back out of the way so that room could be created for wealthier people, and that it was kind of like a conspiracy type of thriller, and it just didn't read very authentically to me, whereas a lot of the other parts of the book did. The thriller felt a bit forced. I didn't buy into it as such, and a lot of it felt quite rushed towards the last 50 or 100 pages of the book. Now that might just be my experience, but I just felt like the thriller kind of took away from the really important narrative that was being explored in the book, and I just didn't buy it. It wasn't a thriller that I found myself really invested in. It wasn't a thriller that really sort of made me nervous. And yeah, I guess the word is just a little bit forced was how the thrillery elements felt, but on the whole, the actual theme of the book, the characters, and most of what was discussed, I found really interesting. I just kind of wish that it was just more of a contemporary book rather than a thriller, because I just didn't love the thrillery elements. I then took a massive pause from reading in order to look after my rabbit for a couple of weeks, and then in literally the last week of January, I managed to finish 3 other books. So the first one of those books was The Furies by Katie Lowe. This was the Dark Academics Book Club pick for January. And honestly, I think the theme and feeling for the whole book club was that this one wasn't that great. I ended up giving it 2.5/3 stars. I didn't love it, I didn't hate it, but I just didn't find myself very invested in the characters. I know it's a really terrible thing to compare every single Dark Academia book to The Secret History, but certain books just lend themselves to that comparison, and this was one because it is set in quite a cult-like historical school setting, and the first line of this book gave me immediate The Secret History vibes. I'm gonna put my coffee down so that I can read it to you. But essentially, the first line of this book reads as follows. The strange thing, they said, wringing their hands and whispering as though we couldn't hear or weren't listening through extension phones or cracks in the walls, was that there was no known cause of death. And anyone who's read The Secret History will know that that book also starts by basically saying there were, one of the worst snows of the year, and basically it was several weeks before anyone knew that Bunny was dead or something like that. So it basically starts with the revelation that a death has taken place. It hints at something terrible having happened, and then gradually as the reader you get to know more and more about it as that mystery unfolds, and you hear about all of the intricacies and events that led up to that dramatic event having taken place. So this book gave me those Secret History vibes and immediately gave me really high expectations, but then I just didn't care about the characters in this book in the same way as I cared about the characters in The Secret History. Within this book, we have a main character, Violet, who is a new student at this school. And once she gets to this school, she ends up making friends with a group of 3 girls, Robin, Grace, and Alex. And she kind of finds out that there used to be a 4th member of their group, Emily, who had passed away, and I believe that is the body that's been talked about at the beginning of this book. So the circumstances of Emily's death are still a mystery, and it's a mystery that has affected this entire school community and the small town that they live in. And then kind of Violet takes the place of Emily in their group, which kind of causes a bit of a stir because it almost seems as if she's literally a direct replacement for Emily. These 4 girls then basically get asked to join a special study group by an art teacher who then starts teaching them about the history of witchcraft at this school and essentially starts training them up as witches. Robin in particular really connects with this witchy history and wants to do lots of different rites and spells and things that she probably shouldn't be doing, and this leads Violet to start to suspect that she might have had something to do with Emily's death, which then I think causes this big moral dilemma for her as she's trying to figure out what she values more, friendship, doing the right thing. Loads of other mysteries arise about what might have caused Emily's death and what might follow afterwards, but essentially, despite having all of the makings of what could be a really intriguing book with the witchy stuff, the cult, the school setting, the murder, all of that kind of stuff seems really interesting, but I just didn't love it. The characters didn't do it for me, and I think in a Dark Academia book, you really need to buy into the characters, and in this book, sadly, I didn't. The next book that I finished was actually an audiobook. I've been loving listening to audiobooks on my daily walk, especially because we are in lockdown at the moment in the UK, so we're meant to be kind of just going out for 1 walk or exercise a day. So I love going out for a daily walk and either listening to a podcast or an audiobook, but in January, I chose an audiobook, which was the Call the Midwife audiobook. This is a memoir by Jennifer Worth, and it was the memoir that then inspired the Call the Midwife TV series, which I love with all of my heart. I've been a fan of the Call the Midwife TV series for several years now, but I've never gotten around to reading the books. There are in total 3 memoirs, so I listened to the first one, absolutely loved it. It was 100% a 5-star read because it was so intriguing. Essentially, if anyone isn't aware of what Call the Midwife is, it is a memoir and then obviously TV series set in the East End of London in the late 1950s. And it focuses on a group of midwives and nuns working as district midwives in this area, which means that they're going out to people in their homes, helping them give birth, looking after them, the babies, all of that kind of stuff. But London at this time in the East End was a very poverty-stricken area, so a lot of the places that they're visiting, the people that they're sort of working with, are dealing with extreme poverty, living in really crowded spaces with not much money, not much space, and not much cleanliness, and it was just really, really intriguing. So Jennifer Worth, or Jenny Lee as she was in the book before she got married later on in life, is new to the area. She's quite a new nurse and midwife, and she basically finds herself being absolutely horrified by these circumstances because she is from a wealthy middle class background and has never had to deal with this kind of poverty or these types of people before. But then she gradually learns more about them, becomes way more comfortable, and essentially does incredible work in this area as she starts to understand how difficult of a circumstance these people are living with and the amount of strength of character that they show in being able to sort of like come through any amount of hardship that they face. If you have watched the TV show but you haven't read the memoir, what I will say is that they are very different experiences. You immediately recognise similarities because the first book I think influenced the first series, the second, and the third. And then after the third series of the show, then the show writers kind of went off book and kind of like ran with it, and now the show is completely fictional. But for the first few series, you definitely notice similarities, characters that came up in episodes of the show, and all of that kind of stuff. So it feels very familiar, but I feel the TV show makes it a much more cinematic experience. Obviously, it's for the TV, so it is going to be more cinematic. But what I mean by that is that they kind of make it a much more rounded story. You have a beginning, a middle, and generally a happy conclusion to each of the stories where things work out for the best. Whereas in the book, it's a lot more graphic. You get a lot more medical information about midwifery, which you don't really get as much of in the show, which I found really interesting. And it definitely shows that not all of these stories ended so well, not everything worked out for people, and that these people living in poverty and hardship were still living in poverty and hardship, and it was really difficult, and not everything worked out for the better. So I do think it's really intriguing to compare. The TV show, I would say, is more wholesome and comforting, whereas the audiobook, the memoir, is a lot more raw, realistic, and a little bit hard-hitting. I love both. I think it's really good to get that rounded view, and I really enjoy both for different reasons, but it was really, really wonderful to finally get around to listening to the memoir that inspired one of my favourite shows of all time, and it's given me an even greater appreciation for how incredible the show is, the story, and basically what happened in the East End at this time and the work that nurses and midwives were doing in areas of poverty. So, loved it, highly recommend for anyone, but especially anyone who is interested in or loves Call the Midwife like I do. And then my final January read was technically half a January read, half a February read. I started it on the 31st of January and I finished it on the 1st of February, so half and half, but I'm counting it, technicalities, as a January read, and there's nothing you can do to stop me. So that book was The Adventures of Tom Bombadil by J.R.R. Tolkien. So this is by the author of the Lord of the Rings series, and Tom Bombadil is a character that features briefly in the first Lord of the Rings book. And this is essentially a collection of poetry which in part focuses on Tom Bombadil, but also focuses on lots of other different characters. There are trolls, elves, fairies, animals like elephants and cats, and all kinds of other things as well. So it's like a very varied range of poetry, focusing on lots of different characters that Tolkien has created. And essentially it's just very like vivid, lyrical, bright imagery, and Tolkien does a great job of creating those poetic stories. However, as a general rule, I don't love poetry. Nothing against this book, it was really easy to read and fairly enjoyable, but I just don't find that poetry connects with me in the same way that I connect with prose, and generally speaking, I don't ever choose to read poetry. I've always felt this way. I absolutely find studying poetry fine. I don't mind like assessing poems, picking them apart, using them critically and writing essays about them, and I absolutely found that fine when I was studying them at university in my English degree, but I've never been one to read poetry for enjoyment. I just don't really connect with it in that way, and that's obviously completely fine. So I haven't really given this book a rating because I don't really know how to rate it. I just don't really know what my feelings are, aside from the fact that it was, you know, fun, fine, easy enough to read, but will I be thinking about it afterwards? No. Will I ever go back and read it again? Probably not. So that's my thoughts on Tom Bombadil. But it is really lovely, and there are some beautiful illustrations. As you can see on the cover, it's a really gorgeously illustrated book, so that's something at least. So that brings my January reading month to an end. On the whole, not too bad given the circumstances, but I am so determined to make sure that February is a better month in terms of reading and hopefully just in terms of life in general. I would love to know what books you picked up in January, if you have any particular favourites or anything that you recommend I pick up. And if you've read any of the books that I mentioned in today's video, then let me know what you thought of them as well. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.